Thanks so far. We have I'd say, in view of the fact we're running late, that we'll have just a few moderator questions and then open it up. I think it's important to get the feedback from and in exchange with the audience here. Just a couple of questions. One recurring theme in all the talks, people acknowledged funding sources. There was I think an NSF grant supporting the SECON study. Kirsten mentioned the STEM ecosystem funders. Rick is working for Skyline, which was philanthropically funded by with money, a donation from to the AAAS. I think you have a corporate connection. So the question for everybody. So scalability is regarded as a good, a public good, but how is that sustainable? And I will open it up to anyone who has insights.
So I'd say one thing is work as hard as you can from day one to make sure that you're not going to be recreating resources that may already be out there. And a good example is websites, right? And so in the informal science education world, if you're getting a grant from the National Science Foundation or pretty much any one of the other federal funders that we would go to, what we've created now is a shared set of metadata. We worked with the National Digital Science Library on this, and what we encourage and push out is like tag everything on your website with this metadata. And then we have a common site, informalscience.org, that will do the crawl and pull those resources in so that there's a single site you go to search for resources. And it gets, for the federal agencies, it's gotten them away from this continuous request of like, fund my website again, and the website can't die, and well, actually it can. And so we have these mechanisms now to make sure, right? And those exist on other platforms, but we've got to be smart about planned obsolescence.
Whose responsibility is the fund? I mean, has society already determined who's responsible for sustaining the scalability?
I mean, for public media, I guess, it's viewers like you, but in turn, I think for that reason, we're also open to, sharing our data. There aren't a whole lot of media outlets who will, talk about how many views that they get. It's kind of a close-kept secret. But whenever I do one of these presentations, especially with other video producers, people come up to me and we start talking shop, and I just wish there was a little bit more of that collaboration. But I think, public media will always be out there giving the data away. I mean, my colleagues are at TechCon right now, another conference, giving the same presentation.
Yeah, I'll just say, Skyline was started with funding originally from 3 foundations with a total of a 5-year commitment for funding, which gave us enough running room to know that we could do this. And hopefully by the end of 5 years, so that we're so successful that we'll get continued funding. We did not intend to actually build beyond that, or didn't feel like we needed to, but as it's turned out, we've been able to attract support from 4 other foundations without a lot of effort, actually. So I'm encouraged that there seems to be support out there to fill what seems like an important need, but it's true. I mean, it could all fall apart in 5 years. We'll see. We have to prove ourselves, and that's what I'm trying to do.
Any comment?
I mean, we're at the very beginning of our work. What I have found, I'm coming from a little bit of a different perspective here. What I have found, 2 things about the mental health space. One is that, one observation is that sometimes people are so focused on taking the existing pie and just trying to get their slice of it, that they actually miss some of the context more broadly. If you look at the largest mental health org in this country, they raised about $17 or $18 million last year. The American Cancer Society raised almost $1 billion, right? And so if you spend your time just trying to find the next one donor or philanthropist or foundation in your individual category, sometimes you're actually missing some of the broader opportunities to grow the whole category. So to me, that's part, and then the other part of it being at BlackRock now is, I think that from a company perspective, from sort of a corporate America perspective, what you're seeing across corporate America right now is a greater recognition that as government recedes on its responsibilities to society, society is expecting more of businesses. And so businesses are beginning, at the very beginning, starting to think more and more about what obligations they have to the communities in which they operate so that they maintain their license to operate. So that would be my point of view.
Great, like be entrepreneurial and vigilant, I guess is the message. Another general question, there was a SciComm study published last year identifying the audience for science communication to 4 categories: disengaged, passive supporters, critically engaged, and then what they called science files. Let me ask the panel, when talking about scalability, where's our target? Who are we? We've had pretty good luck historically with the science files for decades. That's PBS depends on them. Are we aiming for the disengaged? Where do we scale up? How high up do we go?
I'll say that, for Sciline, of course, our immediate audience is reporters. That's the channel we want to go through, but the ultimate audience is the public, so they can make smarter decisions in their lives, whether that means something personal, like a health decision, or something political, like who to vote for. But we have put most of our effort not in the science magazines, the Engadgets, and the Scientific Americans, partly because they should be able to do this on their own, but understandably they can't. They're just as stressed as other reporters. But largely, we're focusing on general news organizations in small to medium newspapers and radio stations in small to medium media markets across the country. These are news organizations, news outlets that serve their immediate communities, and that we feel like is the most important stratum of society for us to hit. They're not science files per se, but they do care about what's going on in their communities, and so often what's going on in their communities has a science story behind it or that can inform it, and that's what we're trying to do.
Can I suggest that I'm not sure that there is one right answer to this question. I mean, the answer depends on the substance of what it is that you're talking about. And, part of the opportunity that exists is, if you're creating one piece of content and putting it out there and thinking that it's going to resonate equally with all audience types, that's just not how it works, right? You have to think very clearly and get very deep on who is it that I'm trying to serve? What are the unique identifiers about the things that they love? Who are their role models that they find to be relatable? Where do they actually consume information? Because consuming it on Twitter is very different than going at home and looking at it on Facebook, which is very different than Instagram, which is very different than reading the news in hard print. And so I think part of the opportunity, I think that there's a huge opportunity, but part of it is thinking about how you create personalized content at scale that actually serves the people in the way that they actually consume information.
Any other?
I think at NewsHour, we try not to think of people as being in silos, right? As like the national news program for PBS, we're really trying to reach as broad of an audience as possible. So I think in terms of science, I'm always just trying to be curious and try to tap into people's curiosity. Yeah, I think that kind of bears out in our research too, is that you do have the people who are very science-minded and science lovers, but there are a lot of people who don't consume science news every day, but you can get them to share a science article. It just kind of depends on how you package the story. So I think you just try to reach as many people as possible.
I'd support that just in saying that I'm not familiar with the study you're referencing, but for example, if you take the Six Americas study, which, as part of a research and evaluation group, we were quite enamored with the Six Americas study. We were able to get enough of the material that we duplicated it in our museum environment. And we were quite shocked to find that the proportions were different from national numbers, but we had all 6 of the audience types from the extreme ends of science lover to science hater represented. And that was a big shock to us, but also very encouraging. And I've seen that happen multiple times, that you take a slice and you find that they are in fact not as homogeneous as you would expect.
One last, am I on? One last question before we open it up. Kind of follow on to a comment that Phil made that applies to all. You mentioned, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, Vimeo, which till this moment I didn't know how to pronounce, YouTube. The question is, how do you keep up with what happens when the millennials get old? And how are you going to keep track of the changing communication environment?
Do you want me to begin?
Please.
Wow, the resident millennial. Well, it's interesting. This is one of like the hottest topics that exists in the market field. And actually, Pew, I'm sure there's some people from Pew here. They do a lot of research around changing consumer behavior, where people get their information, who they trust. Edelman does a great study on the trust barometer, how trust is changing over time. What you find, coming from the background that I come from, is if you are not obsessing every day about the people that you're trying to serve, understanding them, thinking about them in broader ways, beyond just, sort of the first wave of marketing in the digital world was focused on demographics, right? You're gonna group people by their age, by where they live, by their ethnicity. But the next wave is actually around grouping people by shared beliefs and attitudes, where they consume their information, what they care about, and then thinking about spending every day listening and then creating custom content to tell stories that are important, but that they may not just go get on their own, right? That it requires finding sometimes relatable role models to tell you a story about why climate change matters to you, even if you don't think so. So to me, that is like the job to be done, is around obsessing around the people that you're trying to serve.
I think you just keep hiring younger and younger people. I mean, in my shop, the first 4 people who comprised Sideline, one was born in the 50s, one in the 60s, one in the 70s, one in the 80s, and one in the 90s, actually, into the 5 of us. So we had that spectrum covered, and I guess the next one just has to have been born in 2000 or something. It's crazy.
Yeah, I would certainly second the multi-generational. Our exhibit group is the broadest age range of the organization, and it's critical. But the other thing I'd say is, we've done some planning, like 3, 10, 20-year kind of planning, and one of the things we say again and again and again in thinking like that is never presume what content our work is going to be taking in a few years, right? And so documenting in multiple ways, making sure you're able to pull resources together, and policies with a capital P, those are just gone. I mean, think of the web policies that your organization might have had even 5 years ago, right? And access of staff to being able to contribute. I've been in multiple organizations where we went from nobody can touch, what's on social media or what's on the web except the webmaster, right? To you will hear in your performance review if you're not participating actively in social media for the organization, right? So that's going to swing faster and faster, and I don't know what direction it's going to go in. So we do try to make sure we've got multiple documentations, because video is where it's at right now for everything we're doing, but I don't really know what it's going to be next.
Smell-o-vision still hasn't hit. I don't know why.
If I could say, so in our research, we looked at millennials, we looked at older adults. We actually didn't see too many differences in terms of news consumption. Older adults tend to rely on fewer sources, so maybe they have like 2 or 3 go-to news outlets that they like, whereas millennials, they'll pull a story from YouTube, they'll pull a story from PBS NewsHour, hopefully, maybe they'll pull a story from the Washington Post. One thing that connected them is that, I think millennials have this reputation of, loving BuzzFeed quizzes, right? They don't actually want like hard-hitting content, but that wasn't true. I think, similar to older adults, they don't want you to waste their time, and so I think there are a lot of parallels, and a lot of things won't change. I see similarities between, the gags on TikTok, to the gags on Vine, to the gags on like Johnny Carson, right? Like, I think, a lot of things remain the same. It's just kind of about like reformatting the content to the platform.
Great. Well, we could go on and on, but that wouldn't be fair or interesting. So let me open it up, invite people. If you have questions, raise your hand. Mics will come to you. Please identify yourselves, and also ask a question rather than relate a story. So do we have questions?
Hi, my name is Kim Thompson. I'm with the Aquarium of the Pacific in Long Beach, so I'm really appreciative that you talked about the role of informal science institutions. I just wanted to say really quickly, though, so I really appreciated your presentation. I do want to push back just a little bit on approaching individual institutions. I agree with the networks, and depending on your topic, if it's climate change, it's actually probably a great way to go. But some topics not every institution is on board with, and you may get into a rabbit hole you don't want to get into, whereas if you work directly with an institution you know is working on that, it may be a little easier. Just wanted to put that out there. But my question to Rick is, how are you guys deciding what scientific content that you're specifically looking at when you create these boot camps and these training programs? How are you going through that process of deciding which topics you guys are looking at?
We're partly basing it on the kinds of requests we're getting from reporters around the country as we get requests for help on stories. And genomics, which was our first one, just made a lot of sense because it's relevant to so many different areas, as I mentioned, in agriculture and medicine and criminology, in ecosystems, understanding ecosystems. We also were aware of there's a group at the University of Illinois who's been teaching genomics to other non-specialist groups who we've worked with, and we decided we'd collaborate with them, and it was a convenient way to get started in the boot camp business to work with a team of academics who have already taught genomics for non-specialists, for example, lawyers and judges. But from here, we're moving ahead with just based on the kinds of questions that we're getting. We get a lot of questions about environmental issues, about environmental health issues, about living in areas where there's petrochemical development, things like that. So those are high on our agenda right now, as well as the political one that I mentioned.
My name is Modesta Buko. I'm from University of Florida. My question is, how far, just like the moderator asked, how far can we scale, and how important is it to scale to reach out to people in international communities, and how does it impact, how does it influence communication in the local atmosphere? Why I say this is because coming from Africa, coming from Nigeria, I know that we consume more information than we produce, and most of these sources of information are from what is going on in different institutions here. So, I mean, I really thank the Story Collider for giving people like us the opportunity to be part of this conference. So I would want to ask, how does sharing experiences from places, from the developing countries, sharing because this misinformation is actually the same thing everywhere. But then because we consume more, sharing experiences from our different countries, perspectives from our countries, how does it influence local correction of this misinformation?
You want to tackle that one?
We're a completely domestic-oriented operation, so for now, we're not handling international.
Well, that relates to the issue of what's the target? How do we want the world to know? Do we want, yeah.
And yeah, and it's such an interesting point you make about, you know, we'll work with some communities that are much greater consumers than they are producers. I'd argue that's probably more common than we realize. And so it sounds like in your case, what you need is kind of a signal boost, right? Of helping the community be more of a producer of information, or in many ways interpreter of information, right? And certainly even just in North American networks that I've seen, there's had to be a great deal of work to ensure that as you cross borders just in North America, that there's real attention to the community voice that's being served. And it is why, you know, when we're talking about scaling up, I do, right? I think we're on this panel because we're optimists. We believe the scales can go quite far, right? So it is why in that case, you know, the network approach where each node of the network is really embedded in the community, that's so powerful. And I would recommend, if you look at those sites, you'll see some of them are international, and there are ways to reach out and say, all right, come here, like let's do this.
another question about Sciline. I'm curious, how diverse is your database of sources, and what steps have you taken to ensure that it is as diverse as possible?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that. That's actually a major mission of ours, is to diversify the voices of scientists who are talking to the media. So we've made a real effort to try to enrich our expert database with as much diversity as we can. We've scraped vigorously from all kinds of other existing lists that are out there, like 500 women scientists and various minority journalism and science groups. We have been successful on the gender front, I think. Nearly half of the scientists, about 45% of the scientists that we have referred so far to journalists have been women scientists. So I'm really proud of that. It's a lot harder on other measures of diversity, in part because it's hard for us to know in many cases how people self-identify, much less how we might identify them in terms of diversity. But interestingly, we have started to get a number of requests now from reporters asking specifically for minority scientists for their stories. This happens almost every week now, where we'll get at least one request that says, I've already got 2 white male sources. I could really use a woman or a woman of color, which makes it a lot harder for us to find, but we work very hard, and almost every time we manage to do it. But we're doing that all the time anyway, whether we're asked for or not. It actually has raised some difficult questions for us, and I'd be interested to hear from others in conversation later how open we should be about that process, because it came up yesterday, the issues of tokenism and the kind of bad attitudes that can come up, or misunderstandings that can come up if you do start paying attention to race and ethnicity. And we want to enrich for those things. And at the same time, we don't want anyone to think that the only reason we came to them as a scientist to talk to this reporter is because they're African American or Hispanic. So it's a tough question, but we're trying very hard. It's a big, important goal for us.
Valerie Kokenauer. I'm at NIOSH, which is the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health, and we're in Pittsburgh, or at least my office is. So what? This a question for Phil, but maybe more broadly, if you have any influence.
My Permantes fan, is that what you're about to ask?
Come again?
Are you about to ask if I'm a Permantes fan?
Oh no, I was actually going to see if you needed me to send you a sandwich, but I wanted to know a little bit more about any conversations you've had around the pros and cons of using influencers, knowing that they are third parties, that anything could happen. You always hope that your influencers are going to remain stable sources and voices for you. But is it different when you are, I know you're in the early stages, but considering, are you looking to raise awareness? Are you looking for a call to action? What are you asking of them? And how does that affect your calculus and who you approach?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I would say, like, the whole field of influencer marketing is only a few years old, right? And everyone is struggling to understand how best to use influencer marketing. There is a very fine line, which is basically, and whether you're a nonprofit, whether you're a brand, whether you're something else, in each instance, the institution wants the messenger to deliver the exact message that they want, right? Which makes total sense. But the problem is that when Kanye West tweets out something that sounds like Phil Shermer wrote it, no one cares because they can tell it's inauthentic, right? Authenticity is what drives engagement on social, hands down. And so you have to find the right balance between creating guardrails around what you will and will not allow, briefing them properly, but being able to bridge conversationally between what it is that the influencer means when they say X, what their own context is, and also what it is that you're trying to get out there. So it's a really good question. It's very hard, and it requires basically a combination of skills, both the creative side, being deferential so that it's authentic, but also having a point of view about what's out of bounds and what's in bounds. I don't know if that answers your question.
I wondered about you talked about the Katie Couric effect. What about the Louis C.K. effect? What happens when your spokesperson totally loses its influence?
Totally. That's why, like, casting is so important for this sort of stuff. That's interesting about Logic, just as an example, is like, Logic's 28 years old. He is the youngest of 7 or 8 kids. He is biracial. He came from a low-income household, and if you're a Logic fan, you know, like, he is literally the happiest human being you have ever met. And every day, what you see across all of his social and his performances is like a lot of gratitude that he is where he is because he did not come from much means. And so it's about finding the right people who you think represent who are. Yeah, it's a risk that you're going to attach yourself to someone who is going to go do something crazy. This is the trade-off you make.
Any more questions? Oh, we got one?
I have a question about your opinions on sort of the future, since it was discussed sort of what's next. If you follow what's happening or what the Mark Zuckerbergers or so on are promoting in terms of what's next, it seems like it's artificial or augmented reality in sort of immersive gaming environments. And I'm curious, because those systems are going to be completely digital, they'll be very scalable. So do you have any good examples of things that are happening, or if you're thinking of things that can be done in those types of spaces where we're moving to a digital or artificial reality?
I mean, we're doing a little bit of work in augmented reality. So if we go to a place, I think we did this with a story we put out yesterday about penguins. Facebook now has an app where if you take, I guess, a panoramic set of photos around an object, you can create kind of like an augmented reality 3D recreation of it. And so I believe we did that with some Gen 2 penguins. But yeah, that's mainly the space. We've talked about getting into virtual reality. I don't think the platforms have reached the scale where it's worth the investment for us right now. Yeah, that's about it.
I would say that's where we're going to run into issues is the cost, especially for an organization that isn't already occupying that kind of expertise. If you go back to prehistoric times, for Second Life, let's say, right? And there were organizations, a lot of organizations that invested a lot of time and effort in getting into that space. And certainly the early adopters, I think we're happy with the investment, but I certainly heard a lot of negative from those who made a huge effort and then just found there was no lasting value there, not reaching the audience they wanted, so on and so forth, right? So I think there is hesitance, and we're going to need some clear-cut pathways, for lack of a better way to put it, to get more entry points in, I think, for the science communication organizations to feel comfortable really investing in that. So I'd be curious to hear who the partners out there might be who are eager to make that kind of partnership and add value to these new resources by tapping into existing expertise that has expertise in the content and the communication, but no expertise in that medium.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I would totally echo that AR and VR, a lot of people haven't figured out exactly how to use them. They're expensive. One of the most interesting things that I've seen is like the reemergence of audio, podcasts, and voice more broadly. I mean, you're at the very beginning of voice assistants being integrated into everything in your life. And you think about it, like the entire consumer journey there, like they ask a question and they get an answer. Who gets to determine what that answer is? Like the rules of engagement around that are not defined at the moment. But if you look at the whole audio space from podcast to voice, it's all growing rapidly. So that space is a little bit cheaper and easier to access than AR and VR. And so we're seeing a lot of activity in that space.
Yep.
Hi, Ayelet Baram Tsabari from the Technion. My question to Skyline, the Science Media Center in the UK was under criticism that they give much more voice to biotechnology and molecular biology over environmental aspects. And I was wondering, how do you negotiate the issues of different disciplines have different ideas about what is best to tell?
Right. The Science Media Centers, for those who don't know, are similar but pretty different organizations in England and a few other countries that are also connecting in various ways scientists to journalists. They also have an interesting policy on Beats where they do not work on stories about space or dinosaurs. Period. That's just it. We cover every discipline of science. If you're a reporter working on a story about quantum physics, we'll help you. If you're working on a story about psychology or social science, we'll help you. Even economic science, anything the NSF funds, basically, we'll work with you on. We do sometimes get requests that just seem, frankly, a little too lame. For maybe a listicle of some kind, or 5 ways to keep that weight off, or something like that. And we have long Talmudic discussions sometimes about, is this really journalism, or is this just sort of education? Because we don't really want to just be the world's educators. The bottom line for us is that, and we do have a thing on the website that sort of defines what we do and what we don't do, our kind of scope of service. But the bottom line is we're trying to have impact on people's lives. And for that reason, I actually can see why the SMC might avoid stories about dinosaurs, at least, and maybe even about space, because it's not going to have immediate impact on people's lives. And that's sort of our core mission that we try to hew to as we decide what's in scope and out of scope for what we do. I will say, though, that things that are not practically useful to people still can be great because they're so inspiring and because they speak to the power and the beauty of science. Just as you could live without, knowing about the latest space shot, you could live without Shakespeare too, but, would you want to? Would you want to live without art and beautiful things? So I appreciate, the full range of science beats that can inspire people, but at the same time, it's important for us to sort of define where we're going to put our energy, and the defining trait there is impact.
Is there another question? I don't know if there's a mic near you. Or do you have a question back there?
There's one right here.
There's a question right down here, and then kind of creeping into the break time.
Yeah, I changed my mind.
Oh.
So Bill Hallman from Rutgers University. Seekan, I wanted to ask you about the challenges of doing pieces on the social sciences versus the bench sciences, the physical sciences. Do you do many pieces on psychology, sociology, anthropology, and what are the special challenges there?
I do. My background is in neuroscience, so it sort of leans a little bit towards psychology. I put out a piece last week about how no one will believe the Mueller report, no matter what it says, just because there's been so much biased reporting about it. So even if you see the facts, will you believe them? I think the challenges are well known. The replication crisis. Making sure that you have good sourcing, making sure that this single study should be discussed broadly and is worth putting forward to a national audience, and that's not just a single study that doesn't mean anything. I think having a science background, it helps me with judging statistics and whether sample sizes are large enough, whether they're worth pursuing. I think you have the same issues with the hard sciences as well. I was talking yesterday at either lunch or dinner about issues with the embargo system and how I feel like it's created an industry within news media of very unbalanced news, and I think that's kind of, you see that across the board with all types of fields.
Is there a special challenge to making those stories compelling, social science stories compelling?
No, actually, because I find the people gravitate towards them because they're about people. I think it's just telling them in a way that's accurate. Yeah.
So Rick is nodding.
Well, I'll just add that, a lot of times reporters come to us with what kind of expert they're looking for, but they're not really right. And we tell them what they actually are looking for. And a lot of times they'll come to us looking for a neuroscientist, because neuroscientists have just done a better job than social scientists at implying that they know the answer to everything that the brain is involved in. And we often find ourselves correcting them and saying, you know, actually, for the story you're working on, what you really want is a social scientist of one kind or another.
So we're into what should be the break. I'm going to follow Dietram's lead and sort of arbitrarily extend our break. But before I do, I want to thank the panelists for a very thought-provoking and entertaining exchange. Thank you very much.